This is a confusing time to live in the United States. The line between what is legal and illegal is being blurred daily. The line between justice and injustice seems to have been wiped out. And the law, any law, seems to be open to whichever interpretation the Trump administration deems fit. Every week we hear stories like that of Rumeysa Öztürk, an innocent Turkish student with a Fulbright scholarship who was taken by ICE and flown far away to a detention center where the chances of getting her deported are higher. Her crime? Publishing an op-ed in the university's paper. So much for free speech. Every week, it seems, we find Trump signing new executive orders that tighten his chokehold on people's rights, except those of billionaires, of course. One organization that proudly pushed back against what they described in the past as left-wing efforts to restrict speech, and at the time were praised by conservatives, and is now pushing back against Trump and MAGA, is FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, whose mission centers around defending and promoting free speech. And its executive vice president, Nico Perrino, joins me now. Nico, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Glad to be here, Mehdi.
So, your organization does a lot of free speech work, obviously, the clues in the name. Have you ever been this busy? Have you ever faced challenges, the kind of which we're seeing right now, to the First Amendment?
Yeah, I was talking with our legal director last week, and he said in his career, he's never seen this scope, this scale, and this severity of what we've seen in, what is it, less than 3 months at this point? I mean, I could go down the list. We're deporting visa holders, lawful permanent residents who are doing nothing more than speaking their minds. We are going after colleges and universities, revoking their federal funding, conditioning future federal funding on implementing speech codes, violating academic freedom, reforming student disciplinary processes, going after disfavored law firms that represent clients that the administration doesn't like. The Associated Press apparently can't adopt its own editorial standards lest it get booted out of the White House press pool. We have a U.S. attorney here in the District of Columbia that thinks he is Trump's personal attorney, going after critics. And then you have Trump himself, who's filing lawsuits against journalists and media organizations, essentially extorting them for tens of millions of dollars. And you have an FCC that is helping him in this enterprise. So this is, what, 3 months now? I venture to guess where it's going to go in the next 4 years, but we're doing our best.
And we didn't even get started on Elon Musk saying to jail CBS journalists, put them in prison because he doesn't like their editing skills.
And last week he said that they were going after people who proffered lies and propaganda about Tesla.
Apparently you're not allowed to lie about Tesla. That's against the Constitution.
Apparently, yeah.
You're also very generous about AP. It's not even an editorial guidelines, it's just stating what the entire world thinks that it's the Gulf of Mexico. Your organization is one of the few that has been pretty consistent on the issue of free speech on this particular constitutional right. You have defended free speech in the face of infringement by Republicans and Democrats alike, I think it's fair to say. Of course, when you did it while Biden was president, a lot more conservatives took your side. But now that they're doing the infringing, have you seen many of your allies turn into foes?
One of the things that I've learned that's always a truism in free speech work is that most people are free speech hypocrites. John Stewart had this great line that he said, when the only time you stand on principle is when your side stands to benefit from it. It's not a principle, it's a hobby. Yeah. And we have a lot of free speech hobbyists at the moment. Okay. We've lost donors, we've lost friends. We have to acknowledge that we're willing to drive this bus into a wall if that's what it means to stay principled. But I've been, even though I acknowledge the free speech hypocrisy exists, I've been disappointed. And you just have to accept that you have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. Make friends where you can and make enemies where you have to, I guess.
So I have to ask this question. You say free speech hypocrisy. Do you believe conservatives were ever pro-free speech? Because we can be disappointed, as you say, to use your word, about the heel turn on the issue of the First Amendment, on the issue of cancel culture. Remember that? They were obsessed with that. The right. I remember the Charlie Hebdo affair where Muslims were told, you need to understand that being offensive is a Western value. We need to... All of that stuff. Were they ever pro-free speech? Or even at the time, when Biden was in office and you had all these supporters and donors, was someone like you recognizing, well, they could switch tomorrow?
We always recognize that they could switch tomorrow. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I think there are some principled conservatives out there. But I have been disappointed, not just with not aligning with us, not coming to our defense when we're going after these free speech infringements, but more just staying silent or rationalizing the abuses. So for our friends, it's rationalization. For our enemies, it's repudiation. And it's been largely disappointing, but we know that anytime the shoe is on the other foot, that free speech defenders tend to stay quiet.
Liking this video? Now don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism. So what about the criticism of, not specifically your organizations, but people like yourself who were very vocal during the Biden era? I don't know if you saw John McWhorter, the academic New York Times columnist, just did an interview recently with the Free Press where he talked about both sides. And a lot of people on the left, liberals, have been very critical of that framing. And they would argue that perhaps groups like yours laid the groundwork for this by making such a big issue about campus protests against Milo Yiannopoulos, or some of the cancel culture excesses, microaggression excesses that I think we all recognize have happened on college campuses at some point or another. But in hindsight, they all look a little minimal, inconsequential when you now have a government basically going after the First Amendment, going after the free press, going after law firms, as you so eloquently listed. State repression is much worse than some oversensitive college kids. We can all agree, right?
Well, in some cases, you have colleges that are the state, right? These are public colleges and universities, so we need to take that into account. Private universities are not bound by the First Amendment. Often they promise free speech and academic freedom rights, which in some states they're contractually bound to respect.
But you take my broader point.
But I take your broader point, yeah. So we can have a debate as to whether this infringement is worse or that infringement is worse. And I've already conceded that what we're seeing right now in scope, scale, and severity
is worse.
Is worse. Yeah. But we're a free speech organization. Where we see free speech violations, we need to call them out, regardless of whether they are more severe in this instance than in another instance. And I think what you had seen in the past decade are conservatives who were concerned about what they had seen as censorship of their side.
Yes.
And they had made an institution out of this.
But it wasn't the censorship that was the problem. It was the censorship of their side.
That's exactly.
They're happy to censor once they're in power.
That's exactly right. And then, so the question becomes, do you ignore these violations because you tend to have more allies in one particular instance or in one particular period because you're worried of the backlash that might come down the line? Or do you take the infringements as they come and hope that over time your consistency will be recognized by
No,
all
I'm recognizing
sides?
your consistency, but I am saying that we need some kind of hierarchy, right? So if we look at, for example, college campuses, what liberals and woke folks were accused of doing, the censorship that you say. Okay, for example, I remember, was it Charles Murray spoke at some college and people shouted and screamed.
Michigan, and he was at Middlebury.
And there were protests against conservative speakers, right? And that was seen, I'm sure, by your organization as not a good thing.
No, we don't. Well, in the Middlebury case, you had student protesters that were attacking him and his interlocutor.
Yeah, no one supports physical oppression.
Mob censorship.
But in terms of actual, like, people disrupting events and standing outside and saying we shouldn't have this person at our university and we don't like, that, I'm assuming, was bad from FIRE's perspective. But then when you compare that to what is happening now on college campuses, where students are literally being disappeared, Pinochet style, like, it's apples and oranges, we can agree.
Well,
right?
when you look at any censorship case in comparison to another censorship case, there's always going to be relative severity. But yes, anytime you use the power of the state, and we have said this repeatedly, even during the cancel culture debate, anytime you use the power of the state to go after political dissenters, ideological opponents, that's always going to be worse. And right now what you see is the full weight and power of the state coming down on dissenters.
The Trump administration is doing that by using a very controversial, some would say unconstitutional clause of the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act to carry out these deportations or detentions and attempted deportations, based on the Secretary of State, who right now is Marco Rubio, just deciding that someone, a foreign student, an H-1B visa holder, a green card holder, a permanent resident, poses a threat, could seriously, adversely affect the foreign policy of the United States. Merely by their presence and by their speech. Now, Congress passed a limit on that law in the early 90s, which said you could only do that if a particular foreigner's mere presence in the United States would somehow violate a treaty or if it could result in imminent harm to the lives or property of Americans abroad. When you look at a Mahmoud Khalil or some of these other examples, the Turkish student at Tufts, who I mentioned in the introduction, do any of those cases fit that description?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, you have the Tufts student who writes an op-ed, and apparently this is so adverse to American foreign policy that its consequences are so great that you have the Secretary of State booting the student out of the country. And I should also note, a lot of this is done with very minimal due process.
Yeah.
You don't actually know what these people are charged with. If you look at the notice to appear document, which is the document in these immigration proceedings, all it lists is the Secretary of State's authority to deport these folks.
J.D. Vance told Fox recently, the vice president, that these people don't have due process. If you're not a citizen, you don't get due process, apparently.
That's completely contrary to all American traditions. And even targeting visa holders and lawful permanent residents with green cards for their protected speech is totally contrary to the American principles. I mean, the Declaration of Independence says that governments are instituted among men to protect their rights. These rights are not given by government. So to the extent these people are here in the United States, subject to United States jurisdiction, we recognize that they have the God-given right to freedom of speech that can't be violated just because they're not a United States citizen. That's completely contrary to American founding documents. But here we have an administration that thinks, no, they not only don't have free speech rights, they don't have due process rights either.
And this argument that, oh, well, they don't need due process, they're terrorists, they're gang members, etc. A lot of people have made this point, I just want to get your take on this, that if you don't offer even the worst people, even the worst terrorist, gang member allegedly, their rights, then how does that protect American citizens? Because surely if ICE can just decide that someone's a gang member, as they've done with, for example, Mr. Abrego Garcia, who was sent to El Salvador even though he had protected status from Maryland, if they can just say, well, you're a terrorist, you're a gang member, off you go, then what's to stop them from pointing an American citizen and doing that?
Nothing. And this is why due process is so important. The government needs to show its work. The defense needs the opportunity to present evidence that they aren't what the government says they are. Even if you accept that the Secretary of State should have this authority, this unilateral authority to deport someone, and I question that. I question whether that authority is constitutional. Indeed, the only time it has come before a court was in the late 90s and early 2000s when it went before Trump's sister. And she thought that it was
Trump Barry late.
Yeah, Marianne Trump Barry. And she thought it was unconstitutional exercise of executive power. It was later overturned on procedural grounds, not those merits. But even if you accept that authority, you still need to have due process to be able to adjudicate what it means to be seriously adverse to American foreign policy interests. And we're not having any of that at the moment.
We mentioned the media earlier, the AP and some of the crackdowns from Trump and Musk and co. The media is clearly on the receiving end of a lot of pressure from the administration. But how complicit do you think our media is in this assault by Trump on our values? Because you've seen media organizations rolling over in many cases. The ABC settlement of the lawsuit with Trump that they could have won. CBS might settle another ridiculous lawsuit from Trump. You've seen other media organizations not really solidly standing with the AP, kind of doing very kind of minimal gestures of support. How worried are you that the media is just going to roll over in the face of all of this? You've got Jeff Bezos, of course, owner of the Washington Post, big Trump supporter now. We need a free press, an independent free press.
Yes, we do. I am worried not only that they will roll over, but they already have. And behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated.
Yep.
And so when you have Trump filing baseless lawsuits, not just against traditional media organizations, but also the Metas and the X's of the world, and then he comes into office and they immediately settle for tens of millions of dollars, this is just protection money.
Yep.
This is just protection money that they're paying. And you're going to see more organizations start to cave, particularly where they want to have a merger or an acquisition, in the case of CBS, for example, and you have the FCC that needs to grant them permission.
Which is led by a Trumper, Brendan Carr.
Led by Brendan Carr, who, talk about free speech hypocrisy, for the last decade has been talking about how we need to rein in the FCC, how he's the First Amendment champion on that board. He was just at a meeting last week with the DOJ, the Federal Trade Commission. What did he wear on his lapel? It wasn't an American flag pin, as politicians often wear. It was a gold Trump lapel emblem of his face. Now, I don't. That's about as Soviet. That's about as Maoist as it gets. It's become a cult of personality in a certain respect. And you have interim U.S. Attorney Ed Martin here in the District of Columbia saying that he's Trump's personal attorney. Yes. So
and going on Twitter and saying, "Hey, send me stuff that you don't like, and I'll look into people."
Yes,
and people are doing it.
Yes, yeah, it's
looking into people's tweets.
Yeah,
I'm old enough to remember that when the right had a breakdown over the Biden administration saying, "Hey, don't put COVID misinformation on Facebook." Well, and now apparently the district attorney in D.C. can look into people's tweets that are critical of Trump.
I remember when civil libertarians were concerned about the see something, say something mantra that the executive branch pushed out. I remember when they went after colleges and universities for their bias reporting programs, where if you see bias on campus, report it to the administration. We'll bring them in for a conversation and potentially punishment. Now you have the interim U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia doing the same exact thing with the full force of federal government behind them. It's scary.
It is scary. Let me ask you this. Elon Musk has often claimed to be a free speech absolutist. Have we seen any evidence of his free speech absolutism since this administration came to office with his money and support?
No, and we didn't see any evidence of it even after he took over X. We were fairly optimistic that when he took over X, maybe some of the censorship that we'd seen, some of the ham-fisted censorship that we'd seen on X would be better. But we wrote very quickly, I think maybe 2 or 3 months after that on our website, that he was a false prophet, that he wasn't the free speech prophet or savior that he thought he was. So I've been immensely disappointed with that, and he's alienated some of his allies early on, the Matt Taibbis of the world, for example. And Matt told me when I interviewed him, he said, the problem is power. When you have power, the allure of censorship is so strong that most people can't resist it. And that's what you're seeing with Elon Musk. That's what you're seeing with Donald Trump. Donald Trump came into office on a wave of, he's here to protect free speech. I question that. I saw some of the things that happened under his first administration.
He threatened journalists while he was running for president. It was insane to think that this guy was going to protect free speech.
He talked about using lawsuits against journalists knowing that he wouldn't win, defamation lawsuits, but he wanted to make their lives miserable. He's on the record saying that. That's no way that someone with power should act in the United States of America.
Last question, Nico. How much of the damage done to individual and group rights and freedoms here in the US, even in this first 3 months, and we know it's going to be a long 4 years, how much of it is reversible? How much of this can be protected? How much of it may be gone forever?
It depends whether the courts hold up, right? So with the law firms that have been targeted for taking on controversial or dissenting clients and causes, you have seen some of those law firms cave. Skadden, for example, saying that they will spend $100 million on causes that the Trump administration supports. Paul Weiss, for example, caving. But you had Perkins Coie, for example, that stood firm, created a whole splash page on his website about how he was fighting back. And then you did just have an amicus brief filed by 500 different law firms. There is security in numbers.
Yes.
And so the more that people come together, the more that they protect themselves, the more they stand up to these abuses, the more optimistic I become. But if you cave, like a lot of these media institutions have done, I think it's only going to get worse.
If only the media organizations and the universities were to do what some of these law firms are slowly doing. Nico Perrino, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.